Alright guys, you should have your graphic organizer done. And what we're going to do is we're going to fill out our graphic organizer with this information about civil and criminal cases. Now, make sure that you have a tab for definition, purpose, case filed by, decision, type of punishment, appeals, and examples. So let's go through this and talk about each one of these sections. Let's talk about the definition first. If we're talking about civil law deals with disputes between individuals, organizations, or between the two, meaning it can be between two individuals, two organizations, or it could be between an individual and an organization. On the other hand, criminal law is the body of law that deals with the crime and the legal punishment of criminal offenses. So it's kind of easy for us to understand this. If a law is broken, it is criminal law. If there isn't a law broken, but someone is injured or hurt or any other type of damage, then it's going to be civil law. Alright, let's look at our purpose next. Meaning, what is the purpose of each one of these sets? So let's talk about civil law first. Alright, civil law is basically the same thing that we just wrote. Deals with disputes between individuals, organizations, or between the two, in which compensation is awarded to the victim. So there's a new little term, compensation. And we're going to explore that word in just a little bit. So let's look at criminal law. Criminal law to maintain the stability of the state and society by punishing offenders and trying to keep them and others from committing crimes. So the purpose of criminal law is punishing, but also you have to keep in mind it's trying to keep other people from committing the same crimes. Alright, talking about cases filed by, meaning who files the cases? Well, in civil law, it's private party. Now, of course, that doesn't mean an invitation-only party. What it means is individuals file the claim. Nothing to do with the government. On the other hand, criminal law, the case is filed by the government. You've often heard of the prosecution or the district attorney. Those are the types of people that file the cases with criminal law. Alright, decision. What happens at the end of each one of these cases? Well, in the case of civil law, the defendant can be found liable or not liable. And if you look at the screen, replace the word liable with responsible, because basically that's the same thing. So you would have a judge or jury determine if the defendant was responsible for the damage or injury, or if they were not responsible for the damage or injury. On the other hand, we've seen enough TV and law shows to know that a defendant is either acquitted if he's found not guilty and convicted if he's found guilty. So those are the two options for criminal law, either guilty, not guilty, which is acquitted and convicted. And civil law, we're talking about responsibility, liable or not liable. Alright, type of punishment. Well, for civil law, it's a little different. Compensation, which I told you we would hear about earlier, compensation for injuries or damages. Well, hint, compensation, think money, meaning repayment, pay for damages, pay for hospital bills, pay for anything that cost during this process. On the other hand, we know what happens with criminal law. A guilty verdict is subject to imprisonment, which is jail, or fines and community service, in some cases the death penalty. Think back to our law. When you guys wrote laws, many of you wrote in those offenses and you used jail time, community service, fines. Now here's the difference. Compensation goes to the people that were hurt. Fines go to the government, to the city, to the state. So please understand where the money goes. Alright, appeals. Who can appeal? Either party in the case can file an appeal in a civil law, but for criminal law, only the defendant may appeal a court's verdict. The prosecution is not allowed to appeal. So if a defendant is found not guilty, prosecution just has to go with it. Alright, let's talk about some examples very quickly. For civil law, we're talking about landlords and tenants, divorce proceedings, child custody, property disputes, and personal injury. Remember, no law has been broken. However, in criminal law, we think about theft, assault, robbery, drugs, and murder. Now, make sure this is filled out correctly. Rewind, pause, whatever you need to do to make sure that your graphic organizer is filled out correctly.